Hey everybody, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today, we're taking a look at meinen Jesum lass ich nicht, which translates to, I shall not leave my Jesus. This chorale was not in the original performance of the St. Matthew Passion. It was added at a later date and was included in the second performance, I believe, which is the reason why there is a B in the BWV number, not the first B, but the B after the 244. That being said, this chorale is fairly straightforward, not too many twists and turns, so this should be a smooth analysis. We have 4 sharps in the key signature. We start on E major, we end on E major. I reckon we're in the key of E major. We have some neighbor tones in the inner voices here before we get E, E, G sharp, and B. That's another E major triad, no need to reanalyze. Then we get some passing tones in the inner voices. A, C sharp, E, and C sharp spells A major, which is our 4 chord. And then we have a neighbor tone in the bass. And then we have A, D sharp, F sharp, and C sharp. That is D sharp minor 7 flat 5 over A, which is 7 4 3, and then we have some more passing tones going on in 3 of the lower voices here. I guess it is technically the 3 lower voices, but 3 of the voices including the bass: G sharp, E, G sharp, and C sharp. That's kind of like a passing 6 chord, but I will I'm gonna omit that from the analysis because I feel like it's hey, you know what, the bass is actually moving. There's, I guess, a touch of a deceptive progression going on here. We do have a passing 6-6-4 chord before we get F sharp, A, and D sharp, which is just taking our previous 7 chord and putting it in first inversion and removing the 7th. This A is a chord tone. This C sharp is, it was a chord tone. It's no longer a chord tone in the context of how I'm analyzing this triad. Then we get B, G sharp, and D. I guess technically we do have a 3 chord here, so we will mark it as such. 3-6 more specifically. That would be G sharp minor. And then we have some passing tones here, which makes this a perfect authentic cadence. We have B, F sharp, A, and D, which is a passing 5-7 chord, and then we cadence on E major, E, E, G sharp, and E, 3 roots and 1/3 spelling. All in all, I think another way that you could analyze this is you could look at these inner voices as accented non-chord tones as well, and just say that this is 7 going to 5-7, and look at the entirety of this measure as a just a dominant sound leading to a tonic. But 3 going to 5, although 3 is a relatively uncommon predominant chord in cadential contexts, at least as far as my findings are concerned, we do see them from time to time. This isn't unprecedented. It's not the most uncommon, but it's by no means common. But looking ahead, we do have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of B major, and I'm convinced that we start off in the key of B major here. This E major chord is our 4 chord now. We go to B major, B, D sharp, B, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad. Passing tones in the lower voices this time. D sharp, F sharp, B, and F sharp is just taking our B major triad and putting it in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass. We then have 2 chord tones in the lower voices and a passing 7th in the alto, so we just have like a passing tonic 7 chord here. And then we have C sharp, E, G sharp, and E. This is a C sharp minor in root position, which is our 2 chord in the key of B major. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the alto, before we get A sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and E. That is F sharp 7 over A sharp, 5-6-5, F sharp, A, F sharp, and E. It's kind of like taking the chord and putting it in root position, but the chord's not entirely intact afterwards. I suppose the argument for that being is the 5th of the chord is gotten rid of here. It's the only voice that isn't present on and of 4, which means that analyzing this as a root position F sharp 7 chord would be fine, but I tend not to analyze those chords nowadays because they're not entirely intact and doesn't really contribute too much to the progression. But after our 5-6-5 chord, we do get B major, B, F sharp, and D sharp, which is our tonic triad. This G sharp is a non-chord tone, this G sharp is a non-chord tone. Kind of gives us a passing 6 chord here. We'll go ahead and mark that. G sharp minor. And then we get E, B, G sharp, and C sharp. That is C sharp minor, 7 over E, which is 2-6-5. 6 wants to go to 2, so that's a good sign. This C sharp and this E right here, it's kind of like putting the chord in root position. Again, we've seen this a couple of times in this chorale before, but the entirety of the chord is not intact after the fact, so I don't feel like it's really all that valuable to analyze the chord as its own specific contribution to the progression. So I'm going to mention it, but I'm not going to put it on the page. This D sharp is a non-chord tone, but the rest of the notes are chord tones. We then have F sharp, B, F sharp, and C sharp. This is implying F sharp major, which is our 5 chord, but this B is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. We have a neighboring 7th in the bass as well, before we get F sharp, A sharp, F sharp, and C sharp, which is our resolution, that is our proper 5 chord. We have a delayed passing 7th here in the alto before we cadence on B major, B, F sharp, D sharp, and B, which is our tonic triad. Okay, looking ahead, we have a phrase that ends in a half cadence in the key of F sharp minor. Apologies. A couple of things did not make it into the chorale so far. One thing is this E sharp right here. This is not a C sharp minor chord. This is C sharp major, and also there should be an A sharp right here, not an A natural. The reason why A sharp didn't make it into the MIDI file, I imagine, is because A sharp, this is the same A sharp. So when I separated each of the voices into their own line, the A sharp did not get preserved in the tenor, even though the accidental is accurate in the bass. So this E sharp, I don't know why it didn't get into the MIDI file, but this A sharp is, I think, justifiable. But yes, looking ahead, we do go to F sharp minor, not directly from B major. That would be interesting to go to the minor dominant from a major key. They're not super far away from one another on the circle of fifths, so maybe not the most interesting modulation, but it would still be interesting for Bach. Typically the keys that we go to are adjacent, but we are going to end up going back to E major first. B major is now our dominant. We then go immediately to E major, E, G sharp, E, and B, our tonic triad. Passing tones in the lower voices before we get G sharp, B, E, and B, seeing something somewhat similar to the previous phrase, seeing a tonic triad and having it inverted. E, G sharp, E, and B, it's like taking the chord and then putting it in root position, similar to what's happening here, but we have a passing 7th going on in the alto as well, so not exactly the same. Afterwards we have A, E, and C sharp, that's A major in root position, which is our 4 chord. Passing 7th in the bass, this C sharp is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we go to F sharp minor, F sharp, A natural, and C sharp, which is our 2 chord in the key of E major, but in the key of F sharp minor it's also our tonic. We have a passing 7th in the bass before we get D, F sharp, A, and B. This is kind of an interesting chord. This is B minor 7. No, this is a, sorry, melodic minor. This is a D sharp right here. D sharp, F sharp, A, and B. This is B7 over D sharp. Not as interesting of a chord. If it was B minor 7, that's kind of interesting. Typically, seeing a major 4 chord as part of an ascending melodic minor fragment, especially in the bass, is something that's expected of Bach in his chorales. But if we were to see a D natural to an E sharp, that augmented 2nd, especially in the bass like I mentioned, would be not typical for sure. Augmented 2nds are relatively rare as melodic intervals. But yes, so that's a B7 chord, which is a harmonization of the F sharp melodic minor scale. We have a passing tone in the bass. This C sharp is a non-chord tone as well. It's an anticipation. This G sharp is a non-chord tone as well. It's also an anticipation, but when we take the aggregate of all of the notes, we get E sharp, C sharp, G sharp, and B, which is C sharp 7 over E sharp, another 6-5 chord. This time it's a 5-6 chord, 5-6-5 chord more specifically, 4-6-5 to 5-6-5, very common progression in Bach and minor keys. And then we go to our tonic triad, F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, and A. This G is functioning like a 9/8 suspension over the bass or some type of accented non-chord tone, but it's this F sharp that's our chord tone. This is F sharp minor, our tonic. And then we cadence on C sharp major, C sharp, E sharp, and G sharp. Notice how the half cadence has the fifth of the chord in the melody. This is typical of half cadences. Okay, looking ahead, we are going to get another phrase that cadences in the key of E major. We're going to stay in E major throughout. And I'm convinced that in the key of, this will be more of a direct modulation, if anything. In the key of, I think we do go directly here to the key of E major through a G sharp minor chord as opposed to our tonic. You know, if we look at the G sharp, the B, and the B, we have the makings of what would be an E major chord, but we have a D sharp here rather than an E natural. So we're deceived a bit, even though with the E natural happening after the fact, we are in the key of E major. I think the grand scheme of things, we're hearing E major because the melody is hearkening back to what we heard earlier in the key of E major. I guess, and also just before we started the melody, or we started the phrase in the key of E major, and we associated the B's going to the, I guess starting with the two B's, we started that with, or started associating that with the key of E major. We have a passing seventh in the bass and a passing tone in the tenor before we get E, G sharp, and B. 3 going to 1. A kind of unusual progression. We do see 3 go to 1 from time to time. It's very similar to like 1 going to 6 or 6 going to 1. It's two stable chords going from one to the next, so it feels very static because the only note that's changing between the two chords is E natural versus D sharp. So I consider these progressions more static than actually contributing to a trajectory or just sort of swapping a note, and then you typically springboard off of that note swap to some more harmonic movement where a chord with a different function gets introduced. At least that's what I typically find. But we do have another passing seventh in the bass and a passing tone in the alto as well before we get C sharp, G sharp, E, and A. This is A major 7 over C sharp, or 4-6-5. This B is a non-chord tone. This A is a chord tone. We don't need to mark it. And this D sharp is a non-chord tone, so we can mark it as well. But when we have B, A, D sharp, and A, that is kind of like a passing 5-7 chord, or I guess a neighboring 5-7 chord, literally speaking. But when I say a passing chord, I mean a chord that just happens where the semantic, where the definition doesn't line up with other terms. Like when we think of passing, we think of the fact that one note moves to another via stepwise motion in the same direction. But here, clearly all the voices are using neighbor tones. I still call it a passing chord. I don't know, maybe that's just my background in jazz and that's just how I came up using it. But regardless, I'm not going to mark it as a chord. It's incomplete, and I don't really think it's contributing too much to the chord progression. I feel like the chord being there is more incidental in this case. We then have C sharp, G sharp, E, and A again, which is A major 7 over C sharp, so we don't need to reanalyze. And then we have non-chord tones going on in the lower three voices again. This F sharp's like an escape tone, and then we have two passing tones, but we're left with D sharp, F sharp, and A, which is like a passing D sharp diminished chord in root position, which is our 7 chord, and I will mark that one because the chord's entirely intact, and a tonic triads on the other side, E, B, G sharp, and G sharp, which is our 1 chord. 4-7-1 is a very normative progression, and when we see all the time in Bach, this G sharp and this E, they're both chord tones, but they do change the chord to first inversion. G sharp, B, E, and G sharp. The chord's entirely intact, so I will put it on the page. And then we have A, C sharp, E, and F sharp, which is F sharp minor 7 over A. That's 2-6-5. This F sharp's a chord tone, so we can mark it. This G sharp is a non-chord tone, so we will mark it. And this A is a chord tone, so we'll leave it. It's kind of like we're taking the chord and putting it in root position here, and actually for a brief moment we are in root position, F sharp, C sharp, E, and A, so I will mark it for the sake of consistency. However, this A is very brief, so it's not like this chord's getting its own beat or anything. That's why I put it in parentheses, because if the parentheses is on the same line as the primary analysis, that typically, I'm implying the fact that the chord is brief or happening off of the harmonic rhythm, which in the case of duple meter chorales is on beats, are numbered beats, so 1, 2, 3, and 4 will each typically get their own chord. But after our two chord, we have B, B, E, and F sharp, similar to, to our second phrase. We have a 5 chord being implied here, but this E and this C sharp, they're like enclosed. This E is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and this C sharp is an ornament enclosing the resolution. This A is a neighboring 7th as well, and then we get a delayed 7th, very similar to the second phrase. In fact, yeah, I would say that these phrases are more similar than not, or cadences are very similar to one another for that reason. But we have a 5 chord basically being implied through counterpoint over the entirety of the phrase until we get to our final chord, of course, which is E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which is our tonic triad. Okay, we have a short phrase here, but, or actually no, is it any shorter than the I guess it is. No, it's the same length as the first phrase, and it seemed like a normal length. It's also the same length as this phrase right here. Yeah, it's an average length phrase. I don't know why it looked shorter. Oh, you know why it looked shorter? Because the second system only has 6 measures as opposed to the top system having 7 measures. So yeah, it just looks shorter because it's spaced out, but that's just a visual effect. But we have a similar phrase as the third phrase here, where we start in the key of E major and then we move to a minor key, but instead of getting a half cadence, we get an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C sharp minor. So we're looking for a point in which we modulate. E, G sharp, E, and B, that's another tonic triad, no need to reanalyze. Passing tones in the lower voices before we get G sharp, B, E, and B. Tonic triad in first inversion, and we'll just change the figured bass. And then we get E and G sharp, which is just taking the chord and putting it in root position. We've seen this a handful of times, not just with the tonic triad, but with other triads as well. And then we get A major, A, E, and C sharp, which is our 4 chord, very similar to how we started the chorale off actually. And then this B is a neighbor tone before we get A, C sharp, F sharp, and C sharp, which still for all intents and purposes feels like an A major chord, but this F sharp here is changing the root of the chord. This is F sharp minor over A in the key of E major. That is our 2 chord in first inversion, 2/6, and in kind of like a macro deceptive fashion where this 2 would be expected to go to a 5 and then to a 1. This 2 is actually being recontextualized in the key of C sharp, or at least this is how I'm choosing to analyze it. It's being recontextualized as our 4 chord because F sharp also is the subdominant in the key of C sharp minor. We have a passing tone in the bass as well as a passing tone in the alto. Sorry, I forget the word alto way too frequently for some reason. And then we have F sharp, C sharp, A, and D sharp. This is, well, I think D sharp, yeah, no, this is D sharp minor 7 flat 5 over F sharp, which would be 2/6/5. You know, Bach loves 2/6/5 chords. Then we get D, C sharp, F sharp, and D sharp, which is like taking the chord and putting it in root position. But again, I feel like a broken record saying that so many times. If the chord is not entirely intact, I typically don't mark it, but I think it's worth mentioning because if you want to be more granular with your analysis and a little bit more liberal with what you mark on the page, that's a totally valid analysis as well. So it's worth mentioning, but it's not going to make it onto my final score. We then get G sharp, C sharp, G sharp, and D sharp. This C sharp is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. It's this B sharp that's our chord tone, making this G sharp major, which is our 5 chord. And then we cadence on C sharp minor, C sharp, G sharp, and E natural, which is, like I said, our tonic. We get a very similar, there are parallels between phrase 3 and phrase 5, because instead of going to C sharp minor, we go to F sharp minor here, but we cadence on a C sharp chord. Here we go to the key of C sharp and also cadence on a C sharp chord, but it's our tonic rather than the dominant. So there are similarities between the two phrases, but C sharp is contextualized in a different fashion, which I think is pretty neat. But as we would expect our last phrase to be, it does end in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of the tonic, and I do think the entirety of the phrase is in the key of E major, and this C sharp is being repurposed as our 6th chord in the key of the tonic E major. So we start off our phrase with G sharp, E, G sharp, and B, which is our tonic triad, E major in first inversion, neighbor tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto before we get G sharp, E, B, and B, which is just taking our tonic triad and putting it in first inversion again. We don't need to reanalyze it. However, I'm going to take that back actually, because this C sharp here is a passing tone and not what I was ultimately alluding to, but this D natural here does communicate to me that the function of this E major chord is changing, and instead I'm going to mark it as a secondary dominant, because D natural turns the overall quality of this chord to dominant 7, and when this chord is functioning like a dominant, that means that we typically will expect a 4 chord afterwards. So 5, 6 of 4 actually resolves to 4. A, E, A, and C sharp, our 4 chord. And that's not the end of it. We actually get D natural in the alto as well. Passing tone in the bass. This D is a non-chord tone. This B is a passing tone as well. It's a non-chord tone. And this G sharp is a non-chord tone as well. It's a 7th. But when all the voices are moving, this might actually be the first chord that has all of the voices moving. Typically that's indicative of the fact that there's very deliberate subdivision of the harmonic rhythm here. We have B, G sharp, D, and B, and that spells G sharp diminished over B, which is 7, 6 of 4. So if we look in the key of A major, just for these 2 beats, we have C sharp, A, E, and A, which is 4, 6. Just for these 2 beats, this is like 1, 7, 6, 1, 6 in the key of A major, which is very normative progression. We see 1, 7, 6, 1, 6 all the time, or the flip side of that, 1, 6, 7, 6, 1, but 2 tonic triads separated by a first inversion 7 chord is very common in Bach, one of the hallmark progressions, I would say. But we have a passing tone in the bass and a passing 7th in the melody before we get A, C sharp, E, and F sharp. It's F sharp minor 7 over A, which is 2, 6. We've seen 4 go to 2 in a couple of different cadential situations now. Actually, let me make sure that that's accurate. I feel like we have. Maybe I'm crazy. I might actually be crazy. It might actually just be that my notes were wrong, and I'm now just encountering this in the live recording. But regardless, it feels like we have 4 going to 2. We had 4 going to 2 earlier here, but it was recontextualized as 1 in the key of F sharp, so maybe I am a little crazy, and that's okay. This F sharp, this A, kind of like putting the chord in root position, but again, just one of those cases where I'm not going to mark it. B, F sharp, D sharp, and F sharp, that is our 5 chord, B major. Actually no suspension going on here, which is interesting. This B is a chord tone, this B is a chord tone, D sharp and F sharp, those are both chord tones as well. Not that we would ever have any reason to not believe they were chord tones, because they're part of the chord and they occur on the harmonic rhythm. And then we cadence on E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which is our tonic triad in root position, as we would expect a chorale to end. And that is today's analysis. Relatively dense chorale. One of the themes that I'm noticing with all these chorales that are from the St. Matthew Passion are that they are very dense. They have a lot of modulations, and yeah, they explore a lot of different keys, all of them more or less adjacent to one another. But yeah, there's a lot of subdivision of the harmonic rhythm, but all of the chords are functionally harmonic. There are a couple of unusual progressions, but every chorale has its unusual progression, at least one of them, where there are 2 chords that I would say one chord going to the next is not the most likely progression, and that's really all it takes for a progression to be unusual in my eyes, is that it's if the progression is not the most likely destination, or one of the most likely destinations, like 3 going to 1, for example, or 3 going to 5. In this case, they both have 3 chords in them, but that's not that's a coincidence more than anything else. 4 going to 2 is relatively interesting. Just these progressions that are a third apart actually are typically the least likely that a chord will go to, just because of the fact that they share more notes in common than they don't. So those are examples of like static progressions. The introduction of only one note into the texture doesn't really add too much to the chord progression. And Bach terms. But that's all I'm going to say about the chorale for today. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of the chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon. You could also like the video if you liked the video. It helps me out a lot. Tons of chorales to analyze still. I have hundreds of videos in the pipeline, and if you hit the notification icon, you'll be notified of when my daily upload goes live, and I would love to have you along on the journey. But on that note, thank you so much for watching the video, and thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.